In the summer of 1982, a carefully orchestrated immigration fraud scheme vanished into the bureaucratic maze of New York City with $3.7 million in cash and promises. No paper trail, no angry clients stepping forward, no federal investigation. The operation simply dissolved, leaving behind only scattered visa applications and a handful of false addresses. For nearly 3 decades, the case remained buried in filing cabinets, forgotten by everyone except the families who had lost their life savings chasing the American dream. But in 2011, a routine audit of expired visa applications triggered an automated flag in the Department of Homeland Security database. One name, used across multiple applications spanning different years, didn't match any legitimate identity records. That single inconsistency was about to unravel one of the most sophisticated immigration scams in New York history. During the early 1980s, New York City's immigration landscape was a complex web of legitimate law firms, community organizations, and underground networks promising fast-tracked visas for desperate families. The Reagan administration had recently reformed immigration policies, creating new pathways for legal residency while simultaneously increasing enforcement. This shift generated massive demand for immigration services, particularly among communities where English was a second language and legal processes seemed impossibly complicated. Into this environment stepped a man calling himself Vincent Morales, operating out of a modest office in Queens with business cards that listed him as a certified immigration consultant. Morales presented himself as a former federal employee with insider connections at the Immigration and Naturalization Service. His office, located in a busy commercial district frequented by recent immigrants, was decorated with framed certificates, official-looking documents, and photographs showing him alongside men in suits who appeared to be government officials. The certificates were impressive but generic. The documents were outdated forms from the INS, and the photographs were staged with hired actors. None of his potential clients had reason to question the authenticity of his credentials. The scheme was methodical and deliberately targeted. Morales focused on families who had been in the United States for several years on temporary visas, people who had established lives, jobs, and communities, but lacked permanent legal status. These individuals faced constant uncertainty about their future and were willing to pay substantial fees for guaranteed pathways to citizenship. Unlike other immigration scams that made unrealistic promises, Morales offered what seemed like reasonable timelines and legitimate processes. He claimed he could expedite applications through his government contacts, reducing wait times from years to months. His pitch was carefully crafted to exploit both hope and fear. He would meet with families in their homes, speaking their native languages and demonstrating familiarity with their specific immigration challenges. He explained how recent policy changes had created temporary windows of opportunity that would soon close. He showed them thick folders of successful cases, complete with before and after photographs of grateful families who had achieved permanent residency through his services. Every detail was designed to build trust and create urgency. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The financial structure of the operation was its most insidious element. Rather than demanding large upfront payments that might raise suspicions, Morales implemented a staged fee system that appeared reasonable and professional. Families paid an initial consultation fee of $500, followed by a documentation preparation fee of $200, then a filing fee of $2,000, and finally a processing acceleration fee of $3,500. Each payment was justified with official-sounding explanations and accompanied by receipts bearing the letterhead of Morales Immigration Services. The total cost of $7,200 per family was substantial but not outrageous compared to legitimate legal fees for complex immigration cases. What made the scheme particularly effective was its use of authentic but manipulated paperwork. Morales had somehow obtained access to genuine INS forms, which he would complete partially and submit to families as proof that their applications were progressing through the system. He created fake tracking numbers, scheduled meaningless appointments at federal buildings, and even arranged for families to receive official-looking correspondence that appeared to come from government offices. The letters, printed on stolen government letterhead, would reference case numbers and processing timelines that seemed legitimate. The operation maintained careful records, not for legal compliance but for internal tracking. Morales kept detailed files on each family, documenting their payment history, personal information, and the specific promises made to them. These records, discovered decades later, revealed the industrial scale of the fraud. Over 500 families had been processed through the system, with payments totaling $3.7 million collected over an 18-month period. The files also contained notes about which families were most likely to complain or seek refunds, allowing Morales to manage potential problems before they escalated. Geographic targeting was another key element of the scheme's success. Rather than operating citywide and risking exposure through widespread complaints, Morales focused on specific neighborhoods with high concentrations of immigrants from particular countries. He established connections with community leaders, small business owners, and informal networks that helped spread word about his services through trusted channels. This approach created clusters of clients who knew each other, making it easier to maintain the illusion of legitimacy through peer validation. The scheme began to unravel not because of client complaints or federal investigation, but due to changing immigration policies that made some of Morales's promises impossible to fulfill. In late 1983, new regulations required additional documentation that he could not provide, and processing times for legitimate applications began extending beyond the timelines he had guaranteed. Families who had been told their cases would be resolved within 6 months found themselves waiting over a year with no progress. Initially, Morales attempted to manage growing concerns by extending timelines and blaming bureaucratic delays. He scheduled group meetings where he would explain how unexpected policy changes had complicated the process, but assured families that their applications remained on track. He provided updated documentation showing revised processing schedules and even arranged for some families to receive partial refunds as gestures of good faith. These tactics bought him several additional months while he prepared for the operation's eventual collapse. The end came suddenly and without warning. In March 1984, families arriving for scheduled appointments found the office empty, with no forwarding address or contact information. The telephone number had been disconnected, and the building's management company claimed they had no record of Vincent Morales or his business. Mail sent to the office address was returned as undeliverable. Within days, word spread through the affected communities that the immigration consultant had vanished along with everyone's money. The immediate aftermath was chaotic and painful for the affected families. Many had depleted their savings and borrowed money from relatives to pay Morales's fees. Some had quit jobs or made other major life decisions based on his assurances that their legal status would soon be resolved. The discovery that they had been defrauded was devastating, not just financially but emotionally, destroying their trust in the immigration system and leaving them more vulnerable than before. Attempts to pursue justice proved futile. The address listed on Morales's business registration led to a mail forwarding service that had no records of his real identity. The bank accounts associated with his business had been closed and emptied. The photographs and certificates in his office were revealed to be worthless props. Even his name appeared to be fabricated, with no matching records in employment databases or professional licensing systems. Vincent Morales had simply evaporated, leaving behind only empty promises and devastating financial losses. For nearly 3 decades, the case remained dormant. Most of the affected families eventually obtained legal status through other means, while some were forced to leave the country. The $3.7 million was never recovered, and no arrests were made. The scheme became a cautionary tale within immigrant communities, a reminder of how desperation could be exploited by those willing to prey on the vulnerable. But in 2011, advances in digital record-keeping and cross-database analysis would finally catch up with a man who thought he had escaped justice forever. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a routine compliance audit conducted by the Department of Homeland Security as part of their ongoing effort to digitize legacy immigration records. In 2011, federal agencies were systematically converting decades of paper-based files into searchable electronic databases, a massive undertaking designed to improve efficiency and identify potential security risks. Most of this work was mundane, involving the scanning and indexing of millions of documents that had been gathering dust in storage facilities across the country. During this process, automated algorithms were programmed to flag inconsistencies and anomalies that might indicate fraudulent activity. The system was designed to identify patterns that human reviewers might miss: duplicate Social Security numbers, addresses that didn't exist, or names that appeared across multiple applications with different biographical details. Most flags generated by the system were false positives, the result of clerical errors or legitimate name changes. But occasionally, the algorithms would uncover something more significant. In September 2011, the system flagged a series of visa applications that had been submitted between 1982 and 1984. The applications bore different names and addresses, but they shared a common element. All had been processed by the same immigration consultant, listed as Vincent Morales of Morales Immigration Services in Queens. What triggered the alert wasn't the consultant's name itself, but rather the fact that cross-referencing his business registration, Social Security number, and professional credentials revealed no matching records in any federal database. The initial review was assigned to Maria Santos, a compliance officer with 15 years of experience in immigration fraud detection. Santos had seen countless cases of forged documents and false identities, but this particular flag caught her attention because of its scope. The database search had identified over 400 applications connected to Morales, all submitted within a narrow time frame, all following identical formatting patterns, and all bearing what appeared to be legitimate government stamps and signatures. Santos began by examining the business registration for Morales Immigration Services. The paperwork appeared authentic on the surface, complete with official state seals and notarized signatures. But when she cross-checked the registration number against New York State business records, she discovered that the number had been assigned to a completely different company, a small accounting firm that had operated in Manhattan during the same period. The registration documents for Morales' business were sophisticated forgeries, created using legitimate templates but filled with fabricated information. The investigation expanded as Santos delved deeper into the applications themselves. Each file contained photocopies of supporting documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, employment records, and financial statements. The documents appeared genuine, but closer examination revealed subtle inconsistencies. Birth certificates from different countries used identical fonts and paper stock. Marriage licenses bore official seals that didn't match the jurisdictions they claimed to represent. Employment letters contained formatting errors and grammatical mistakes that suggested they had been created by someone whose first language wasn't English. Most revealing were the photographs attached to each application. Federal regulations required that all immigration photos meet specific standards for size, background color, and image quality. The photos in Morales' files met these technical requirements, but they shared an unusual characteristic. They had all been taken in the same location, against the same neutral backdrop, using the same lighting setup. Despite representing families from different countries and backgrounds, every photograph showed subtle shadows and reflections that indicated they had been shot in identical conditions. Santos compiled her findings into a preliminary report that outlined the scope of the suspected fraud. The evidence suggested that Morales had operated a sophisticated document mill, creating false paperwork for hundreds of families while collecting substantial fees for services he never intended to provide. The scale of the operation was staggering. If each family had paid the average fees documented in the files, the total amount of money involved would exceed $3 million. The case was elevated to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Fraud Division, where it was assigned to Special Agent David Chen. Chen had spent the previous decade investigating complex financial crimes involving immigrant communities, and he immediately recognized the hallmarks of a professional operation. This wasn't the work of a small-time con artist, but rather a carefully planned scheme that had exploited vulnerabilities in the immigration system while avoiding detection for nearly 30 years. Chen's first step was to locate surviving victims of the fraud. Using the addresses listed in the applications, his team began reaching out to families who had been processed through Morales' office. Many had moved multiple times since the 1980s, but patient detective work eventually led to contact with several dozen individuals who remembered their experiences with the immigration consultant. Their stories were remarkably consistent, describing a charming and professional man who had promised quick results and delivered nothing but heartbreak. One victim, Elena Rodriguez, had preserved every document from her interaction with Morales. She had kept the receipts, the correspondence, and even the business card he had given her during their first meeting. Rodriguez explained that she had held on to the paperwork for years, hoping that someday she might find a way to recover the $7,200 her family had paid. Her meticulous record-keeping provided investigators with crucial evidence about how the scheme had operated and the methods Morales had used to maintain his deception. The investigation revealed that Morales had employed several sophisticated techniques to avoid detection. He had used multiple bank accounts to process payments, spreading the money across different institutions to prevent any single financial entity from noticing unusual activity. He had maintained separate telephone lines for different aspects of his business, allowing him to compartmentalize his operations and limit his exposure if one element of the scheme was discovered. Most importantly, he had cultivated relationships with legitimate businesses in the immigration services sector, using their reputations to enhance his own credibility. Chen's team also discovered that Morales had been preparing for his eventual disappearance long before the scheme collapsed. Records showed that he had been gradually liquidating assets and transferring money to offshore accounts throughout 1983. He had canceled his office lease with several months' advance notice, claiming he was relocating to larger facilities. He had even arranged for a mail forwarding service to handle correspondence after his departure, creating the illusion that he was still operating while he planned his escape. The most significant breakthrough came when investigators located the photographer who had taken the identification photos for Morales' clients. The photographer, now in his 70s, had kept detailed records of his commercial work from the 1980s. His appointment book showed that Morales had brought groups of families to the studio on scheduled days, paying cash for hundreds of photos over an 18-month period. The photographer remembered Morales as a well-dressed man who spoke multiple languages and seemed to be running a legitimate immigration business. But it was the photographer's description of Morales' physical appearance that provided the first real clue to his true identity. The man was approximately 6 feet tall, with distinctive scarring on his left hand and a slight accent that suggested he might have been born outside the United States. These details, combined with the operational methods identified during the investigation, began to paint a picture of someone with both the sophistication to run a complex fraud and the connections necessary to obtain authentic government forms and letterhead. As the investigation progressed, Chen realized they were dealing with more than just immigration fraud. The scale, organization, and execution of the scheme suggested that Morales had likely been involved in other criminal enterprises before and after his immigration consulting business. The question was no longer just about recovering stolen money or providing closure to victims. It was about identifying a career criminal who had spent decades operating under false identities, exploiting vulnerable communities, and disappearing before authorities could catch up with him. The case was about to take an unexpected turn that would finally reveal the true identity of the man behind one of New York's most successful long-term fraud operations. The breakthrough that would finally unmask Vincent Morales came from an unlikely source, a clerical error made nearly 30 years earlier that had gone unnoticed until advanced database algorithms began cross-referencing information across multiple federal agencies. In 2012, while Chen's team was still working to identify potential leads, a separate investigation by the Social Security Administration into identity theft cases from the 1980s flagged an unusual pattern involving fraudulent Social Security cards issued in the New York metropolitan area. The SSA investigation had identified approximately 24 Social Security numbers that had been issued to individuals who appeared to have no legitimate existence in federal records. These weren't simply cases of undocumented immigrants using false numbers, but rather sophisticated forgeries that had been created using authentic government materials and processes. The cards themselves were genuine, but the identities they represented were entirely fabricated, complete with false birth dates, addresses, and employment histories. What connected these cases to the Morales investigation was a single administrative detail that had been overlooked for decades. When Social Security cards were issued in the 1980s, clerks were required to maintain carbon copies of all applications in case the original documents needed to be retrieved. These carbon copies, stored in boxes in a Brooklyn warehouse, contained handwriting samples and signature specimens that had never been digitized or analyzed. When SSA investigators examined the carbon copies for the fraudulent cards, they discovered that 12 of them bore identical handwriting, suggesting they had all been completed by the same person. Agent Chen requested copies of these handwriting samples and compared them to the signature specimens found in the Morales Immigration Services files. The match was immediate and unmistakable. The person who had created the false Social Security applications was the same individual who had been operating the immigration fraud scheme. This connection suggested that Morales had been running multiple criminal enterprises simultaneously, using his access to government forms and processes to create false identities for both his own use and for sale to others. The handwriting analysis provided investigators with their first concrete evidence that could potentially be used to identify Morales through forensic comparison. But more importantly, it revealed that the immigration scheme had been just one component of a larger criminal operation that had likely involved document forgery, identity theft, and financial fraud on a massive scale. The man, calling himself Vincent Morales, wasn't simply an opportunistic con artist, but rather a professional criminal with the resources and connections necessary to obtain authentic government materials. Chen's team expanded their investigation to include the Social Security Administration's findings, creating a joint task force that brought together expertise in immigration fraud, identity theft, and document forgery. The combined investigation revealed a pattern of criminal activity that stretched back to the late 1970s and potentially involved dozens of false identities. Bank records from the period showed that Morales had maintained accounts under at least 6 different names, all supported by fraudulent Social Security cards and identification documents. The task force also discovered that Morales had been using a sophisticated network of mail drops, answering services, and temporary addresses to maintain his various criminal enterprises without establishing a permanent presence that could be traced by law enforcement. He had rented office space under different names, used different telephone numbers for each identity, and even maintained separate checking accounts for different aspects of his operations. This level of compartmentalization suggested extensive experience in evading detection and indicated that he had likely been operating similar schemes in other cities or states. A critical breakthrough came when investigators located a former employee, Morales Immigration Services, who had worked as a receptionist during the final months of the operation. Carmen Valdez had been 19 years old when she was hired to answer phones and schedule appointments for what she believed was a legitimate immigration consulting business. She had never been interviewed during the original investigation because she had left the job several weeks before the office closed and had moved to California shortly afterward. Valdez provided investigators with crucial insights into how Morales had operated on a day-to-day basis. She described him as a meticulous man who arrived at the office early each morning and stayed late into the evening, constantly reviewing files and making telephone calls in multiple languages. He had insisted that all client interactions be conducted in person rather than over the phone, and he had personally handled all financial transactions, never allowing her to process payments or access the filing cabinets where client records were stored. Most significantly, Valdez remembered that Morales had frequently received visits from well-dressed men who spoke with him privately in his office behind closed doors. These meetings typically lasted less than 30 minutes, and the visitors always left carrying manila envelopes or small packages. At the time, she had assumed these were business associates or government contacts, but in retrospect, she suspected they might have been involved in his document forgery operations or other criminal activities. Valdez also recalled that Morales had maintained two separate sets of appointment books, one that she was allowed to use for scheduling client meetings, and another that he kept locked in his desk drawer. The second appointment book appeared to contain meetings and activities that were unrelated to the immigration consulting business, including regular appointments on weekday mornings and weekend meetings at locations outside the office. This suggested that the immigration scheme had been operating alongside other criminal enterprises that required careful scheduling and coordination. The investigation took another significant turn when Chen's team discovered that several of the fraudulent Social Security cards identified by the SSA had been used to obtain legitimate employment at federal agencies during the 1980s. The most significant of these was a card issued under the name Roberto Silva, which had been used to secure a position as a clerk in the Immigration and Naturalization Services Queens Processing Center. Employment records showed that Silva had worked at the facility for approximately 18 months, during the exact period when Morales Immigration Services had been operating. This discovery explained how Morales had been able to obtain authentic INS forms, letterhead, and processing procedures. He had literally been working inside the system while simultaneously defrauding it, using his legitimate access to government materials to enhance the credibility of his fraudulent operation. The position had also provided him with detailed knowledge of immigration procedures, processing timelines, and documentation requirements that had made his false promises seem realistic to potential victims. Employment records for Roberto Silva showed that he had resigned from the INS position in February 1984, just 1 month before Morales Immigration Services had closed its doors. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, suggesting that he had been planning his exit strategy well in advance and had used his inside position to gather final intelligence before disappearing. Personnel files indicated that Silva had been considered a reliable employee with excellent attendance and no disciplinary issues, demonstrating his ability to maintain a convincing, legitimate identity while operating criminal enterprises. The task force requested all available records related to Roberto Silva's employment, including his original job application, background check materials, and any photographs taken for identification badges. The application contained a wealth of biographical information that had never been cross-referenced with other databases, including previous addresses, employment history, and personal references that could potentially lead investigators to his true identity. Among the most promising leads was a reference letter from a previous employer, a small accounting firm in Manhattan that had supposedly employed Silva as a bookkeeper during the early 1980s. When investigators contacted the firm, they discovered it had gone out of business in 1995. But the former owner was still alive and living in New Jersey. The owner, Michael Brennan, had kept detailed employment records from his business and agreed to meet with investigators to review Silva's file. Brennan's records revealed that Roberto Silva had never actually worked for his accounting firm, despite the reference letter bearing his signature and company letterhead. The letter was a sophisticated forgery that had been created using authentic materials, but contained false information about Silva's employment dates and responsibilities. More importantly, Brennan recognized the name Roberto Silva from a different context, one that would finally provide investigators with the break they had been seeking for over a year. In 1981, Brennan explained, his accounting firm had been contracted to handle payroll services for several small businesses in Queens, including a document translation service operated by a man named Antonio Restrepo. Restrepo had mentioned during casual conversations that he occasionally hired temporary workers to help with large translation projects, and one of these workers had been a man who went by Roberto. Brennan had never met this individual personally, but he remembered Restrepo describing him as highly intelligent and skilled with languages, someone who could translate documents between English, Spanish, and what sounded like Portuguese. The connection to Antonio Restrepo opened an entirely new avenue of investigation that would ultimately lead to the identification of the man behind the Vincent Morales identity. But it would also reveal that the immigration fraud scheme had been far more complex and far-reaching than anyone had initially suspected, involving an international network of document forgers and identity thieves who had been operating across multiple countries for decades. The investigation into Antonio Restrepo revealed a connection that would finally crack the case wide open. Restrepo, now in his 70s and living quietly in Miami, had maintained meticulous records of his translation business from the 1980s. When federal agents approached him in early 2013, he initially seemed reluctant to discuss his former employee, but his demeanor changed dramatically when investigators showed him photographs recovered from the Morales Immigration Services files. Restrepo immediately identified the man he had known as Roberto, though he revealed that this wasn't the only name his former employee had used. During their working relationship, Restrepo had discovered that Roberto possessed multiple sets of identification documents and spoke with subtle accent variations that suggested he might be adopting different personas depending on the situation. What had initially seemed like impressive linguistic versatility now appeared to be evidence of systematic identity manipulation. The translation service owner provided investigators with payroll records showing that Roberto had been paid under 3 different names during his employment: Roberto Silva, Vicente Moreno, and Carlos Mendoza. Each identity had been supported by different social security numbers and addresses, but the physical descriptions and handwriting samples were identical. Restrepo explained that he had overlooked these inconsistencies at the time because Roberto was exceptionally skilled at his work and had helped the business secure several lucrative contracts with law firms and government agencies. More significantly, Restrepo revealed that Roberto had frequently discussed his background during their conversations, claiming to be a former government employee from Colombia who had immigrated to the United States in the late 1970s. He had mentioned having extensive experience with official documentation and bureaucratic procedures, knowledge that had made him invaluable for translating complex legal and administrative documents. But he had also made casual references to ongoing business ventures that seemed unrelated to translation work. Armed with this new information, investigators began searching federal databases for immigration records related to Colombian nationals who had entered the United States during the specified time frame. The search was complicated by the fact that many records from the late 1970s had been destroyed or damaged, but eventually they located a set of documents that would provide the final piece of the puzzle. In November 1978, a man named Eduardo Santamaria had applied for political asylum at the Miami field office of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. His application contained detailed biographical information, including photographs, fingerprints, and a lengthy personal statement describing his flight from political persecution in Colombia. The physical description matched the details provided by Restrepo and other witnesses, but more importantly, the fingerprints on file were an exact match for prints recovered from documents in the Morales Immigration Services office. Eduardo Santamaria's asylum application revealed a sophisticated and educated individual with extensive experience in government administration. According to his personal statement, he had worked for several years in Colombia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, handling visa applications and immigration documentation for Colombian citizens seeking to travel abroad. His familiarity with official procedures and document formatting had been acquired through legitimate employment, but he had apparently decided to use these skills for criminal purposes after arriving in the United States. The asylum application also contained information that explained how Santamaria had been able to operate undetected for so long. He had entered the United States legally and had followed proper procedures for requesting asylum, creating a legitimate paper trail that had provided cover for his subsequent criminal activities. His background in government service had given him credibility when dealing with immigrant communities, many of whom naturally trusted someone who claimed to have official experience with immigration procedures. Federal agents tracking Santamaria's movements through various databases discovered that he had been arrested briefly in 1987 under the name Carlos Vega for a minor financial dispute in Chicago. The arrest record included current photographs and updated fingerprints that confirmed his identity, but more importantly, it provided investigators with leads about his activities during the years following the collapse of his immigration consulting business. The Chicago arrest record showed that Santamaria had been operating a check cashing service that had been investigated for potential money laundering violations. Though charges were ultimately dropped due to insufficient evidence, the investigation files contained detailed financial records showing suspicious transaction patterns that suggested ongoing criminal activity. Bank records indicated that large amounts of cash had been processed through the business, far exceeding what would be expected from legitimate check-cashing operations. By 2013, investigators had assembled a comprehensive profile of Eduardo Santamaria's criminal career, spanning over 3 decades. They had traced his activities from his arrival in Miami through his various identity changes, document forgery operations, and financial crimes in multiple states. But despite having identified his true name and accumulated substantial evidence of his criminal activities, locating his current whereabouts proved challenging. The trail went cold after 1995, when Santamaria appeared to have ceased using any of his known aliases. There were no employment records, no bank accounts, no property purchases, and no interactions with law enforcement under any of the names investigators had connected to him. It seemed that he had either died or had once again reinvented himself using identities that remained unknown to authorities. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the Internal Revenue Service. In 2014, IRS investigators conducting a routine audit of suspicious tax filings identified a pattern of returns that had been submitted using Social Security numbers belonging to deceased individuals. The returns were professionally prepared and showed modest but consistent income from small business activities, suggesting that someone was using dead people's identities to maintain a low-profile legitimate existence. One of these fraudulent returns had been filed under the name Thomas Mitchell, using the Social Security number of a man who had died in 1989. But when investigators examined the handwriting on the tax documents, they found it matched samples taken from Eduardo Santamaria's asylum application and the Morales Immigration Services files. After nearly 30 years of hiding behind false identities, Santa Maria had finally made a mistake that would lead authorities directly to him. The address listed on Thomas Mitchell's tax return led federal agents to a small apartment complex in Phoenix, Arizona. Surveillance of the location revealed an elderly man who matched Santa Maria's physical description, living quietly under the Mitchell identity, and apparently running a small tax preparation service from his home. He had aged considerably since the photographs in his immigration files, but fingerprint comparison confirmed that Thomas Mitchell was indeed Eduardo Santamaria. On March 15, 2015, federal agents arrested Santamaria at his Phoenix apartment. The arrest was conducted without incident, as the 71-year-old man offered no resistance when confronted with evidence of his true identity. A search of his residence revealed boxes of forged documents, multiple sets of identification papers, and detailed records of various criminal enterprises he had operated over the decades. Among the most significant discoveries were financial records showing that Santa Maria had continued laundering money through various schemes long after the collapse of his immigration consulting business. Bank statements and transaction logs indicated that he had processed millions of dollars through shell companies, fake businesses, and identity theft operations. The $3.7 million stolen from immigrant families in the 1980s represented just a fraction of his total criminal proceeds. During his initial interrogation, Santa Maria maintained the Thomas Mitchell identity and claimed to have no knowledge of Vincent Morales or Eduardo Santamaria. But when presented with forensic evidence linking him to the immigration fraud scheme, he eventually acknowledged his role in the operation. His confession provided investigators with details about how the scheme had been executed and revealed the locations where some of the stolen money had been hidden. The case concluded in federal court in 2016, where Eduardo Santamaria pled guilty to charges including immigration fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and tax evasion. At his sentencing hearing, several of his victims provided impact statements describing how his crimes had affected their families and communities. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $4.2 million in restitution to his victims. Though most of the stolen money was never recovered, the conviction provided closure for families who had waited over 30 years for justice. The case became a landmark example of how modern investigative techniques and interagency cooperation could solve complex financial crimes that had remained dormant for decades. It demonstrated that even the most sophisticated criminal operations eventually leave traces that determined investigators can follow, no matter how much time has passed. Eduardo Santamaria died in federal prison in 2019, taking with him the secrets of other criminal enterprises that investigators suspected he had operated. But his conviction had finally answered the questions that had haunted immigrant families since 1984, proving that the man who had stolen their dreams and their money had not escaped justice forever. The case served as a reminder that in the digital age, there is no such thing as a perfect crime, only crimes that take longer to solve.